All right. It seems that we are finally live. I'm going to run a quick sound test to check. And everything sounds incredible, so we are going to start. Please let me know along the way if anything fails, but everything looks good, so I'm going to introduce our artist for today. Today we are going to be talking about Edvard Munch, and like I said in my previews, this isn't going to be an easy conversation, but it's going to be a very rewarding one at the end of the day, because Munch is an artist who really manages to capture the human emotion. Like I said once again in my preview, a lot of artists aim to depict strong and powerful emotions, but Munch isn't one of them. Munch is an artist who's going to show you the most basic and in a way mundane elements of depression. So, without any much further to do, let's go ahead and start with our first painting for today. So, our first painting is this, the view of Tethelsbakken with Gamle Aker Church. Munch was a Norwegian artist, so I'm going to be not amazing at saying all of the Norwegian and Scandinavian names, but bear with me. Munch was born on December 12th in 1863, and as you can see from the date of the first painting that we have, he didn't start painting early. When we talked about Klimt and Titian the last couple of times, they were all starting as childhood prodigies. They were born in artistic families, and they started to draw from a very early age. Munch was not. He was, in a way, he was technically educated. He went to a technical college. He excelled at math, he excelled at physics and the sciences, and he was more than likely going to be an engineer. But something ended up, and we ended up having one of the greatest modernist artists just ever. What we have here in this first drawing, we can see the big influences that the modernist period had on him. We see the effect of Impressionism. We didn't really talk about any Impressionist artists just yet. We will, of course, in the future. But Impressionism is marked with a special kind of tendency to depict nature and to depict objects the way they are in the moment. So, how a landscape or portrait would usually be painted in the classical style, it would be painted over a long period of time, with many times the artist coming back to the subject, and that's what differentiates old portraits from photographs. The artist really got to know his subject, and he was really able to dig into their mind at different times of day, different days, different weeks. Impressionists basically threw that out of the window and decided that the goal of art was to depict color the way it was, since black and white photography already appeared at this moment. They decided that the best thing that an artist could do right now is to depict color instead of form. And that's what we see here. Munch was not classically educated in art, which is why he doesn't really have that ironclad hand that, for example, Titian had or Klimt had. He cannot really draw in the classical sense. What he can do is have an excellent feeling for color and depict things the way they are. This isn't a great example of a work. You can see the perspective is all messed up with the houses. you could just look at a couple of the houses in the foreground and see that horizontal lines are there where they shouldn't be, and it generally falls out of place if you look at it intensely enough. But from a distance, this is incredible. You could hang this up in your living room, and you wouldn't really mind, because it's a nice picture that really, in a way, depicts the feeling of this small Norwegian town. And that's all that mattered to the Impressionists, and that's what mattered to early Munch. One more of these artworks, just so you see where he's coming from, in a way. Munch, in his early days, I'm going to show you only a few of his early artworks, was really interested in this kind of rural Norwegian scene. And that's unsurprising, because that's where he was born. He was born far away from Oslo, far away from, back then it was called, if I'm not mistaken, Kristengard, so Christ City, instead of Oslo. But Munch wasn't from there. Munch was from this small Norwegian town, and this is all he knew. His father was probably the biggest influence that was had on him, aside from his mother and his sister, but we'll get to those later. But his father was a deeply religious man, and he didn't really consider art to be a trade. So he didn't support Munch's goals of becoming an artist, and that's what pushed him to go to technical school, try to become an engineer, but things ended up the way they did. Another one of these landscapes, I'm just showing you this just so you get a feeling. I'm not going to spend too much time on any of these. This is high school level. Simple as that. A high schooler should be able to just draw up a landscape like this. Of course, one who goes to art school. Put air perspective like this. Probably do the linear perspective much better than Munch actually did. Once again, pay attention to the houses. But that's not Munch's goal again. Like I said, he's not a technical artist, and his goal isn't to depict nature the way it is. His whole goal throughout his artistic life would be to depict feelings the way they are, and to depict how nature affects feelings. And this is the first, basically, Munch work that I consider to be the jumping off point. This is his father, a portrait of him on the couch. There's a lot of different versions of this work, just like other works. When I was preparing for this talk, I decided to Google the complete database of all of Munch's works. And it turned out that Munch had created throughout his life listen to this number, 1,789 works. That's enormous productivity. Of course, Munch lived a very long life, but a lot of artists with a long life cannot brag about this kind of number of artworks. Now, you may be wondering, is every single one of them unique and different? No. Munch liked to copy a lot of his works and come back to them over time. I'm going to show you a couple of examples of that, but if I were to analyze each work and how he affected and how it was changed throughout Munch's life, we would be here for a God knows how long amount of time. But this is the first work of Munch. Why? Why do I say it's his first major artwork? Well, first of all, Munch stops basically drawing this pastoral image of Norway, and he decides to go straight for the portrait. Now, in my opinion, the portrait is the most difficult genre in art. Why so? Because you have to dig into psychology of a person. With a landscape or with a scene, you don't really have to worry about how the person looks. You could just paint it on. But with a portrait, you really have to get a feel for the person. And as I said, while classical artists would do this by long sessions where they would talk and try to bring out the feelings of a person, Munch does it in a completely new and, like I said, impressionist, and I would even call this expressionist way. So, you can see that if you take a look at the details of the subject's hand and on the newspaper, you can see it's washed out, it's blurry. It's not what a classical portrait should be, but it gives you the feeling of what and who Munch's father was. He was this pious man who had control over the family, and Munch would live with that for the rest of his life. He would essentially turn away from religion due to just how ritualistic his father was in terms of religion. Sorry for the repetition. And he continues on. This is his first self-portrait. Munch would draw many self-portraits throughout his life, and I want you to keep this one in mind, because this is the first, basically another first marker on how he would develop. This is, again, not a bad portrait. He has this impressionist tendency still. It's not a classical portrait in any way. You could visibly see the brushstrokes on the background, and you can see how he basically made his jacket just using the paint knife, just scraping it down along the canvas. Although I even wonder whether this is canvas at all, because Munch didn't like canvas. He used cardboard for a lot of his works, and which is why I'm thinking now, what canvas has had a monopoly over artworks since essentially the time of the post-Renaissance, in a way, since artists have moved on from wood, like in the Netherlands, and from murals, like in Italy. They moved on to canvases because canvases were convenient. You could roll it up, you could transport it wherever. But Munch abandons this material, and I think he's one of the first major artists to do so. But I got ahead of myself. We're moving on, and this is, again, the second self-portrait. You can see how, over the course of 6 years, it degrades to such a degree. Why do I say it was... Why do I say that it was such a unique and such a difficult 6 years? I'm going to fix my mic. Alright, we'll try this. So, this was a very unique and a very productive 6 years for several reasons. I'm going to read a quote from Munch about this time. He said, a couple of years after this self-portrait, "I live among the dead. My mother, my sister, my father, my grandfather. Kill yourself, and then it's over. Why live?" And this is where we get to see Munch as the artist that he was. He was surrounded by death. His whole family in this interval of the 1880s was almost entirely eliminated, and he was left alone. And this is the first big point of degradation for him. Well, degradation as a human being, obviously, but as an artist, this gave him plenty of room to start thinking. Because once he was left alone in his head, he started to think. Just like Goya. We talked about Goya a couple of weeks back, and you could basically see the same thing. An artist cannot live comfortably. An artist has to live, in a way, in stress. And while some artists live happier lives than others, you still need that element of discomfort, because otherwise you're not going to think. You're going to think about your everyday, you're going to think about the flowers, you're going to stop every day to smell the roses. And you're not going to be able to produce artworks. And so in 1889, Munch meets Hans Jaeger, depicted over here. Jaeger was one of Norway's prime nihilists, and we're going to touch a bit more on philosophy later today, but I want you to remember this other current that would go throughout Munch's entire life, and that would be nihilism. Nihilism would follow him for the rest of his life. Why was this special? Well, because Munch, like I said, his whole family is now gone. He's all alone. No one's there anymore to tell him what he can and can't do. And so what he does is fall into this company of nihilistic philosophers and Norway literary societies who would direct him on his philosophical journey. And this is the first work that we can really say, if you'd seen Munch's art style, you would now instantly recognize, yes, this is him. This is, if I'm not mistaken, his sister Inger on the beach. And why do I say that it's so special? Well, because this kind of pose of a person looking out into the waters, into the Norwegian fjords, would follow him, again, as another motif of his artworks. And I believe that this would inspire his later works like Melancholy, because it gives this feeling of emptiness when you look at it. You sit down and you just look out. It's this 1,000-yard stare in a way, where you're only thinking about yourself and you can't even enjoy the nature outside. A fascinating artwork, but with Munch it's an exponential growth, so I'm going to skip through this one fairly quickly as well. Another beautiful artwork. Munch, this is a rarity. I believe there's another work that I included later on, which is going to follow this other side of him, which I'd like to call the proletariat one or the workers one. Munch isn't a social artist. There are a couple of artists who make it their goal to talk about society's problems, to try to help the poor and so on. But this isn't trying to help them. This is a sort of sympathy mixed with disgust simultaneously. And so what we have here is this poor, probably worker who walked into the bar to drink after a long day of work. And what does he have to show for it? Just a couple of coins that he's going to toss into the barkeeper's cash register to get drunk. Again, it's a difficult conversation to have about Munch, because a lot of artists have happy periods and sad periods. Like Klimt, for example. He had his golden period, and then he had his darker period. But this isn't the same. Munch has no light period. All he can see in the world is the darkness, because he lived in that darkness. And it wouldn't be surprising if I tell you that his favorite writer from his childhood was Edgar Allan Poe. And he associated a lot with Poe. He associated with his dark worldview, his dark death. Munch constantly contemplated suicide throughout his life. It wasn't a pleasant being. And another unique thing, a lot of artists believe, let's call it like this, a litmus paper test of an artist is how he treats the nude. Now, the nude has a long and complicated history in European art, but for the most part, when an artist has a room full of models and he draws them, usually it's something sexual. Usually he's going to be using them in one way or another, for both his paintings and for other reasons. You know why. But Munch isn't like that. He was married, but he married very late, and we don't know any stories of him treating his models good or bad. We don't know if he had a studio like Klimt or Schiele, where he would have models constantly walking around naked, and so when Klimt could pick up his robe and do his business in the studio. But Munch isn't like that. He's afraid of it. He's afraid of women in general. And it's this feeling that pervades through all his artworks. For example, if you remember Klimt from last time, his sketches of his models, he would depict them in erotic poses, them hugging each other, kissing him, hugging themselves. Munch doesn't do that. He picks such a strange moment of the model scratching her arm, basically the least erotic motion that you can imagine for a human being. It's fascinating. And also the pastel technique. Munch, we've seen masters of oil paint with Titian, we've seen masters of gold with Klimt. Munch's preferred medium is the pastel. And it's this division of everything into these lines that by themselves are patches of color just by the technique that he uses with the pastel. It's kind of fascinating. I'm going to let you sink into this artwork for a bit while I take a quick sip of water, because this is the start of the full-on depression. All right. So this is Melancholia. At first it was called Evening, but as Munch made progressively more and more later copies of this artwork, he came to the name of Melancholy. And like I said, this is the first one, so don't judge it too harshly. He's going to develop it later on in his life, but you already see what's going to make his artwork him. Usually when you have a scene, you want to have the figure interacting with the environment. Not at all what's happening here. And this completely rough pastel artwork with naked colors. I like that term when it refers to Munch. Naked colors. He doesn't blend it in. He doesn't try to hide it in a way. He uses completely honest and bare colors, that purple wave in the ocean and the brown stones. It's unfinished, of course, but it already gives off the feeling that Munch wants to give, and that's the main point with Expressionism. You have to feel it before you do anything else. And so, even with this absolutely unfinished sketch artwork, you're going to be stuck in there, and you're going to be stuck on that Norwegian fjord, thinking about whatever bothers you the most deeply. And there's no one around to help you. Not even in that house, in those cottages in the background. No, you're alone. It's only you and your problems in the world. After that, Munch goes on a tour through Europe. He stops in Paris, he meets plenty of philosophers and writers, and he stops by in Monte Carlo. Monte Carlo was the Las Vegas of the late 1800s, and here you have it. I like to think of it, again, as a portrait more than a scene. Because even though the faces are completely washed out, and you cannot recognize a single facial feature on these people, you get the feeling of losing. You get the feeling that all of these people came here to become millionaires at the roulette table, and they all lost. And you even ignore the absolutely messed up perspective in this artwork at first. When you look at it, what you see is the people. You don't see that the roulette that should be an ellipse from this point of view. It's a circle. It doesn't bother you. Only when you start looking into it. But when you see it for the first time, it hits you, and you get the emotion. And again, that's all that matters. What you have here is the first of his classical works of depression. Sick Mood at Sunset, and this one he later on called Despair. This composition is, again, staple that's going to follow him through the rest of his life. What you have is a bridge with its perspective shifting into the left side of the canvas over a fjord with the sky turning blood red. I'm going to read the exact quote that he called it later on when we talk about the scream. But here you have it. Your friends walked off into the distance. Imagine this situation. You're out with your friends on a night. You're outside after a bar or two. And for a second, they walk off into the distance talking. And for some reason, you can't follow them. You stay behind for a bit. And you look off into the distance. And you feel that despite being with these people, despite being with your friends who you know for such a long time, you're alone. Alone with the world and alone with your problems. And that's what the despair is about. It's not despair of the person. It's despair of the universe around the person. Wonderful artwork. And again, completely unfinished. But you still get emotion. What you have here is the start of another series of artworks that's called The Kiss. No one in European art has made love so depressing as Munch. If you remember last time we talked about We talked about Klimt one of the last times, and we saw his kiss, and his kiss is romantic, even though he puts the female above the male, even though he's a lot more interested in the woman. It's still interesting to watch. It still has that air of eroticism around it, that air of love. What love is here? First of all, the composition is horrible from a professional point of view. The focus of the lovers should be at the center, but at the center we have this window, as if we should be paying attention to what's going on outside, rather than the love scene. The centerpiece are the drapes, and the only reason why the lovers stand out is because they're a darker shade of blue than everything else. It's it's strange, and if in Klimt's case we couldn't see the face of the male or the female, here we don't see the faces of anyone. They're muddled in each other, and this is less of a kiss and more of a kind of vampire, and I use the word vampire specifically. Because in Munch's opinion, everyone is parasiting on everyone. Everyone is feeding on each other's energies, and it sometimes feels like you're the only one who doesn't, and you're the only person, again, alone with the universe, even when you're together. The second version of melancholy over here. I keep echoing today, aren't I? Let me try. Let me try this. Let me try. Alright. Let's try this. Please let me know if it's echoing again. But what we have here is the second version of melancholy, and this one is a lot more worked through. This time the subject of the painting, which most of the time with Munch is going to be a self-portrait, distorted, but still a self-portrait. What we have here is him looking away from the nature, looking away from the people in the background with the sky. And once again, alone. I'm going to repeat this word over and over again. This time he uses paint. He doesn't use his preferred pastel. And it works a lot for the color scheme of the painting, with these brushstrokes showing. And here you can see that he saw Van Gogh. Once he visited France, once he visited Monte Carlo, Paris. Van Gogh may not have been popular during his lifetime, but after his death, his popularity absolutely exploded. And that's what we have here. We have Van Gogh's influence on European art. We usually don't talk about it, because Van Gogh doesn't have a lot of students in European art. But Munch is one of them, and he is a very powerful one. The sky is almost like a dusk version of Starry Night here. And Starry Night is going to have a profound effect on Munch, since he sees the same colors that Van Gogh saw in the sky, unlike a lot of other artists who just paint it blue. This is one of my favorite artworks of Edvard. This is Evening on Karl Johan, and we're going to stop at this one for a short bit. First of all, like I said, perspective, completely messed up. Where do you see in the world, walk outside right now and look at the street in front of you? Windows are going to be facing like rectangles away from you in perspective, floating away. Here we have them facing forward despite the houses being directed away down the street. Windows are facing forward, brightest light, giving off no shadows. And it seems like they're looking at you, but you don't even notice the windows at first. What you notice is the people staring at you. And if you move away from the focal point, which is the people walking down the street. If you shift your gaze a bit to the right, you see the one person moving in the other direction. It's speculated that this is another self-portrait from Munch, that he never felt that he was at place. He felt that he was always moving in the opposite direction from everyone, which he was. He was probably the most avant-garde artist out there at this point. And these people, you can't help, when looking at the faces, to feel like they're dead. And you're right, Munch never really grasped how to draw faces. He grasped how to draw skulls. And this paleness, these bulging eyes, this is the view of a skull, not of a human being. And if you remember, I just mentioned Van Gogh. If you remember Van Gogh's view on the cafe in Arles, you will remember how it's pretty similar, how the right side is bright and the left side is completely dark, and you have the motion of people. In Van Gogh's case, he draws up that metaphor of the 12 apostles and Jesus. Here it's different. Munch, remember, abandons basically all of religion in this work. We're going to talk about why in a bit, but what we have here is what Heidegger in a way called Geworfenheit. Heidegger in his philosophy of the design, he introduced this topic of Geworfenheit, which was the idea of throwness into the world, that we are thrown into a world that is alien to us and which tries to harm us at every turn. And that's the feeling you get, and it's not a coincidence that Munch really resonated with a lot of these contemporary German continental philosophers. Again, a fascinating artwork, and if you ever see the real deal, it's even more chilling. Speaking of German literature, what we have here is a portrait of August Strindberg, who Munch met on his journey through Europe. Strindberg was an incredibly popular Norwegian playwright, alongside Ibsen, and I feel like he affected Munch a lot more than Ibsen. We're going to talk about him in a bit, but Strindberg really focused on these kind of domestic problems and how absurdist they are. Strindberg draws them in a completely Van Gogh way. If you remember Van Gogh's portraits of, for instance, the postman, or his self-portraits, you see that it's this diagonal hatching using paint. I shouldn't be using the word hatching, because hatching only refers to graphical works, but Munch manages to do it with paint and with pastel. Not going to stop for too long here, but again, this is a really insightful portrait, and it really helps you tie together art with the rest of European literature at this point. But this portrait we need to talk a bit about. This is the portrait of Dagny Ewell, and she was one of Munch's closest friends. She was a Polish woman living in Norway. I have her Polish last name written down. Ewell is her married name. Her Polish maiden name was Przipszewska. I'm so happy I was able to talk that through. But that was... She was an avid supporter of Polish independence and of Polish sovereignty, and she was one of Munch's closest friends. And the same way when we talked about Klimt, we talked about Emilia Floge, and the way that they were really friends, and Munch took out his sexual feelings on other women, and this was completely platonic. Here we have pretty much the same exact thing. Ewell was one of Munch's closest confidants. They were, once again, a rare case of male-female friendship that usually doesn't happen, doesn't last. A fascinating portrait, completely different from the one we just saw of Strindberg, as this one is completely not impressionist. It's absolutely caloric in a way where the only color that's not blue is the face, and everything else is completed in blue shades. With all of my dislike for Picasso, this seems like something out of his blue period, not out of Munch. Fascinating portrait, absolutely. Dagny would also be Munch's model for a lot of paintings. We move on. as we move on. So keep that in mind. We'll come back to this. Munch had other models, obviously, and Dagny was probably his intellectual model, but he had plain ones too. Once again, it's a mystery to me what kind of atmosphere was in Munch's studio, because with Klimt I can imagine what it was. It was a paradise for example, for hippies, where it would be this free culture. But with Munch, as long as I thought about it, I cannot imagine what it could have been like. This study is telling of what Munch did to the body. He would continue the tradition of the expressionist of breaking and making bodies ugly. When we talk about Schiele, he would distort bodies. Munch does it differently. It's not an anatomic distortion, but it's an emotional one, surely, where the model is more or less in a natural pose, but there's something eerie about it, even just by the way it's done, by the way the dress is made semi-transparent, where you can just see the paper showing through, where it's, again, absolutely unfinished for an artwork and too detailed for a sketch. It's a mystery to me. But what we have here is another example of Munch saying a big hello to Van Gogh. Starry Night. Completely different from Van Gogh's, but the subject is more or less the same. Van Gogh drew his Starry Nights while he was in the mental asylum. Munch did it while in his own mental asylum. Not in a physical one, but one in which he locked himself in, constantly thinking about death and about his problems, and not being able to rip out of it. And so while Van Gogh's Starry Nights are energetic with what I like to call worms and waves in the sky, this one is calm and serene. You can see the smudged pastel all over the sky. If an art student brought this to any art teacher in the world, they would say this is horrible. You don't smudge pastel like this. It's not designed for it. And Munch does it. But he makes it different. He makes it he has the paper shining through feel like the sky. And it grabs at you differently. Again, a wonderful example. And I hope one day that we can get somewhere organized a Van Gogh Munch exhibition of them together, because they play together like no other artists do. And here we have this first painting that would be his fixation on death. There's two versions of this painting. I'm showing you the first one. This one's called Death in Spring. And this contrast, again, I'm wondering what he thought. Because spring is a time when you usually don't think about death. You think about death in the fall or in the winter when it's cold and dark and you don't have sun. Spring is when nature remakes itself. It's when nature comes alive. No, Munch thinks about death. Munch thinks about this pale skull lying in the casket with a fresh spring branch. He is absolutely hyper-fixated on death. He can't think of anything else in the world at all. The next one is by the deathbed, which you could probably regard as a continuation of the first one, just from a different view. Again, absolutely unfinished, but this time he continues on with showing, even when there's problems in the world, and that's the scariest part, people don't care. You could see the smiling faces on the left side of the canvas and the smiling skull of the Grim Reaper on the right. Nobody cares except for this select few in the darkness in the foreground. Nobody else cares. The universe goes on. There are tragedies going on each and every day, and yet no one is there to feel it. And it fills you with emptiness. You don't feel sympathy towards the dead person, mainly because you don't see it. The attention is hyper-fixated on the relatives in the front, but they're not mourning either because we don't see their faces again. We just see how dark they are with the color that Munch uses. And we see laughing faces in the background of those who don't care at all. another continuation of this, death in the sick room. Again, a bunch of relatives have collected to pay their final duties to the dying person. What should we feel? I mean, obviously the first instinct is to feel sadness, is to feel pity. But we don't. What we see at first glance is this strange and awkward composition. And then we take a look at the face that's looking directly at you. And again, you get the slight feeling that it's a skull. It's not a face. People are looking away. The dead person we don't even see, where it's obstructed by the chair. What we do see is the face of death in the front, staring at us with those red eyes. It's a horrifying artwork. And it shows the mundanity and the boring aspect of death. When death is depicted in movies, you usually get a feeling of people crying, people sobbing, you get last words, you get these last bursts of energy. No, not here. What you get is emptiness. And we have finally reached the most famous work that even those of you who never heard the name Munch, those of you who have never heard about art in general, you will know this painting. You will know it either from the emoji, you'll either know it from Home Alone, you'll know about it from any of the merchandise that it has been slapped on over the past 100 or so years. And it brings me great sadness that it has killed the value of this work. Because if you haven't seen this before, it's scary. I'm going to read you the quote that Munch wrote about it. I was walking along the road with two friends. The sun was setting. Suddenly, the sky turned blood red. I paused, feeling exhausted, and leaned upon the fence. There was blood and tongues of fire above the blue-black fjord. And the city. My friends walked on, and I stood there trembling with anxiety, and I sensed an infinite scream passing through nature. Do you feel that? Now, misconception number one about this painting. The figure isn't screaming. Nature around it is screaming. The figure in the foreground is stuck. It's one of those moments of fear when you can't even react. He is frozen in time. Once again, remember that image that we saw with despair. That was just sadness. This is fear. Again, imagine yourself in this scenario. It's sunset, you walk along with your friends, they walk along further, and you stop and you get this momentary feeling for a split second, but it feels like ages where you feel like nature is screaming at you with all of the pain going on around in the world. And you're just stuck there. No one's there. Your friend's walking off, and you're stuck on this bridge contemplating why live, like Munch said. Again, depression and sadness isn't dramatic. Nature can be dramatic, but you're there. You're not screaming. You don't have the energy to scream anymore. You and your skulled face that's going to eventually die. You're there in shock because you can't do anything about it. Take a couple of moments to dive into this artwork again, because even if you've seen it before, feel it in a new way. It's not a scream. The figure isn't screaming. You should be screaming. This next artwork that we're going to be talking about is another start of a series. And I'm struggling to find words for it. This is probably my favorite out of Munch's series. I like it even more than The Scream. For one specific reason. There is no single way to interpret this artwork. Because on one hand, Munch has scenes of consolation where two people try to feel each other's pain. But initially, this work was called Love and Pain. Munch always called it Love and Pain. But among viewers and among Munch's friends, this work has gotten the nickname of the vampire. And if you take a second look, you could see why it is. What at first can be thought of as a consolation or a hug of someone being sad, at a second look can be seen as a figure biting into and sucking away at the life force of another person. And that's what I think Munch feared most about relationships. He was afraid that if he were to confine in another person when he was sad, when there was no one else to support him, he, at his weakest point, your feelings are going to be just sucked away in order to feed the other person, just so they can have control over you. This isn't the best rendition of this artwork, in my opinion. It's the first, and like I said, with every new iteration, Munch adds something new to his works. But it's a fascinating one. What we have here is, in 1894, absolute banger after banger of artworks. Every artwork, complete masterpiece. Here we have Puberty. And I'm going to quote Edvard Munch on this when he described this artwork. It's what he called the fear of growing up. This kind of Peter Pan complex. Again, at first glance you could yell, this is pedophilia, this is everything. Sure, over the centuries of art, many messed up things have been happening. But this is different. This is probably the artwork that understands the teenager the best. Your body's going crazy, you don't know who you are anymore, you're changing, and above you is that shadow of whatever trauma you think you might have experienced that's going to follow you. If you lived a happy childhood, congratulations, you don't feel this. But every person at least thinks that they had something dark that they're hiding behind them. And so this girl who's afraid to grow up, who's feeling these effects, ripping her apart, you can see this cold stare at you. It's not a Peter Pan feeling of, I don't want to grow up because I want to live in a happy childhood. No. It's the fear of, how am I going to grow up from this childhood? If everything's bad now, it's going to get worse. It's this, again, horrifying feeling. Again, sink into this artwork. This one you've probably never seen before. But I want you to. If you want to think of your problems, if you want to think of the boring depression that you feel is lingering around with you, remember those teenage years, or those early years of puberty right here, of growing up, of trying to claw your way out of the confused mess that your brain and your hormones are. Again, horrifying artwork. This one is the next rendition of Melancholy. The houses are finally gone and shifted into the complete background. People over here are having fun in the background. They're going to be in a boat. They're going to have a happy day at the beach. No. Once again, you're stuck. And this time you're staring into the water. And this, I think, is the closest Munch has ever got to outright saying what he felt about suicide. It doesn't come from a burst of passionate emotions. It's not a feeling of, oh, this big one thing happened. No, it's these little straws that eventually break the camel's back. That what we have here, it's these little moments of loneliness, little moments of depression, little moments of sadness, little moments of anguish, that build up eventually, and this stare into the water of, you're here alone, you and nature, dealing with your problems. Here we have another artwork called Constellation, which is very unique for him. I couldn't find many graphic drawings of him with pencil or with black charcoal, what I believe we have here. Here, I'm unsure of this artwork, because on one hand, I can, once again, interpret it in one of two ways, like the vampire, where it could either be an incredibly humanistic and moving scene from Munch, where he tries to show that in dark moments there are people you can lean on, or there's another way of looking at this, that there's always going to be the dark spot in you, and no amount of light from any other person can help you, because you're still going to be stuck there. I'm not going to spend too much time on this artwork, because it's just a sketch, and Munch probably abandoned it for a reason. But an interesting peek, for sure. What is interesting is this. This is called Woman, or Three Ages of a Woman. If you remember Klimt's Three Ages of a Woman, he showed it through sexuality. He showed it through the joy of motherhood and eventual aging and death. Here, it's the triumph, I'd like to say, of anti-sexuality. Because despite the nude being the centerpiece, it's strange. And let's start from left to right on this painting, like you would with a book. Left, you have the first stage. You have youth. You have this optimistic look at life. And subsequently, more and more to the right, you get darker. After youth, after the optimism, you have this pride. You have this feeling that you're on top of the world, you're in charge of everything, this triumph. And then you have darkness. And then you have what's on the far right, which is the man, of the artwork. I'm going to once again quote Limonov on this, where he called this artwork the triumph of women over men. We saw with Klimt how he showed the sexual power that women have over men. Munch shows emotional power. He shows that no matter how much you try, you're still going to be inferior in a way. You're still going to be stuck in the darkness because you will always have these feelings. It's a strange feeling, and again, it's a feeling of absolute depression that you're going to try to show, that Munch's trying to show here, that, for example, I'm trying to think of a way to say this in a more positive light, but I can't, so I'm going to say it the way I'm thinking it. It's a way of, in a way, your image compared to the rest of the world, where you see how people around you are flourishing, how they have these dreams, how they are fulfilling them, how they have triumph in their life. And you're stuck there in the far right, you're stuck in the darkness, looking down on yourself. And you're completely powerless, both over yourself and over other people. You're done. What we have here is a return to the topic of sadness and of the scream of nature. But this time, if you remember the Carl Johan Road, it's a combination of these two. If in this composition before, Munch tried to showcase loneliness, here he shows that even in crowded scenarios, that scream of nature does not quiet down. It's still going to be yelling at the top of its lungs, trying to get you to, not just you, but all the people ignoring it. Because in the scream, the person was at least trying to react to it. He was stuck in that moment. And in anxiety, the person was melancholically trying to look down. But here, this anxiety is anxiety of people. This adds on a new layer, because who is having anxiety? Take a quick moment to think. Which person is having anxiety in this painting? And it's supposed to be you, the viewer, not anyone in the painting. Those people are on their business. They know what they want. They don't have the time to pay attention to the scream of nature. That's the gaping wound of a world without any moral compasses. But they're looking at you, and they want to ask you, hey, what moral compasses do you have? Because for them, it's all figured out. They want to make money, they want to have a job, have a house, and so on. Why don't you think that way? And you're stuck here alone because you see that scream of nature in the sky, and you see these people's skulls staring at you, and there's your anxiety. The monk feels depression very closely when the whole world, it feels like, is against you, when everyone's staring into you, including nature itself. Aside, and just another quick point before we move on. Aside from the normal perspective that is just a simple one-point perspective into the left side of the page, I feel like this work includes in itself a hint of backwards perspective. Backwards perspective is a very complicated technique that is 90% only used in iconography. But here, I feel like Munch included it through the air, where it focuses at you. You're the centerpiece of this artwork. Because I want you to ask yourself the question, what is the center of this artwork? And you're going to come to the conclusion that, again, it's you, with all of the people facing directly out of the canvas, which, again, is almost always a bad technique for both art and photography. But here it works. It isolates you in front of the painting. And we have the last one out of this series. We have despair. If anxiety shows, again, the people against you, this one shows you against yourself. And the portrait is on purpose done as vague as possible, because every person is supposed to see a chip of himself in there. Either in the dark eyes, in the sullen view. If you imagine yourself at your lowest point in life, you're going to see yourself in here. Again, I'm not going to stop for too long at this artwork because we've seen a bunch of compositions like this. But feel free to take a pause and look inside of the person in the foreground. And think of him, and think of you inside of him. This one, I'm going to leave you to think about for a quick second before I say any comment. Alright, so let me start by saying that this artwork was obviously modeled after Dagny Yule. She is, for sure, named as the model that was done in this artwork. And on one hand, this is the strangest, I believe, Madonna in European art. Strangest, why? Because we have never seen an erotic Madonna. Even Klimt didn't go that far. Klimt, the most erotic artist out there. No one has ever dared, in a way, to show the Madonna's sexuality. But is this really sexuality? I want you to think for a second. Is this really it? No. In a way, it's anti-sexual, despite the completely, in a way, pornographic pose and nakedness of the subject. It's strange because there's nothing erotic going on about it. It's, once again, this triumph of the female form where she doesn't even have to be erotic to capture your mind. She just has to exist. And she tramples over everything. And Munch never called this artwork Madonna. It was unnamed, and a lot of other of his friends gave it this title. But I feel like it's fitting, because when we discuss the mystery in Christianity of, for example, the Virgin Mary and why we call her that, it's this reverence of how, without what we usually attribute to as a human need of sexuality, she is able to be superior to all of us without it. And a very strange artwork. Very strange. But also very useful to think about and very useful to look at. One of my favorites. Munch tried. I'm going to start with this. Munch tried a very humble attack on women. After the Three Ages of a Woman and after that Madonna, he humbly tried to say that, no, they don't have power over me. And he failed miserably. This one is another artwork modeled by Dagny Yule. And this one's called The Day After. And we all know what this Day After is. We see the bottles in the foreground. We see this position of the lady in the painting. And even here, despite Munch trying to disfigure the form, once again, not anatomically, but emotionally, showing how she is nothing, she still manages to be graceful in this artwork. She still has that superiority. She may be sleeping. She may be at her least powerful moment. And yet Munch can do nothing. He's a very strange artist, and I'm wondering why no one has ever focused on Munch's sexuality before. Because it's true that it's not his biggest topic, but it's also a strange one which he desperately tried to avoid in a lot of artworks. What we have here is my favorite version of the vampire, because this one is most clearly defined, and this one has these absolutely beautiful red ginger pastel streaks across the artwork, where you can mistake them for either red hairs or the streaks of blood that the vampire tries to pull out of the person. We talked about the vampire before, but I just wanted to show you my favorite rendition of the artwork. This is my egotistical moment. Here we have ashes. What we have depicted is the burning down of the house, and we have these two versions of horror. And what this artwork makes me think about is Masaccio. If you take a look at Masaccio's Expulsion from Heaven, if I'm not mistaken, it's in Florence, you'll see how different reactions occur to it. And here, Munch tries to do the same. In Masaccio's case, Adam, during the Expulsion from Heaven, is covering his face and exposes his body, and Eve covers her body and exposes her yelling face. Here we have a weird combination of both, with the man hiding everything and the woman exposing everything. No nudity, again, and so it's not erotic, but you get a weird chill coming from this artwork. Even despite the very light color combination, it's still a very dark artwork with this sickly yellow face and the woman ripping out her hair almost. And the man obstructing with, again, completely powerless, even when he should be stepping up and trying to instead fill that masculine role. If you remember Titian's men, those pounds upon pounds of muscles. No, this is a person under the steamroller, thrown out. And another subject over here, jealousy. Again, a powerless figure in the front who's staring out at you because he cannot turn around to do anything. Munch would copy this subject over and over again, different times, with different faces of the person looking at you, but it's another strange example of him being afraid to confront who he is and confront his own sexual feelings. Strange artwork. This is his probably best period, the 1890s. But here we have a return to the self-portrait. Munch loses interest in what's around him and tries to figure out what's in himself. A strange self-portrait to be sure. There's going to be stranger to come. But by technique, if you take a look, it's horrible. An art teacher would tell you don't know how to use a paintbrush. If you take a look at the white streaks at the bottom right and the black streaks on the bottom left. You don't know how to use a paintbrush. That's not how you use paint the right way. And yet it works because you don't notice it at first. What you notice is the face engulfed in smoke. Engulfed in the smoke that the person surrounds himself in. And I feel like Munch did this for a purpose. He wanted to hint that all of the problems in his life are self-caused. Not in all the death that's been following him that was caused by him. No, not at all. But the way he feels about it, the way he always drags himself into this smoke is what he wants to show you. He can't get out of it, and he doesn't want to either. He keeps smoking on and adding on to the suffering that's going on to him. Another self-portrait. This one is probably my favorite out of the self-portraits. A graphical artwork, a print. His self-portrait with a skeleton arm. And this, I feel, is the most honest one. We ignore everything else and we just want to know what the face is. And the face gives us, again, this skull-like image, which is emphasized by the skeleton hand at the bottom, and this 1,000-yard stare looking at you out of the canvas, out of the paper, not the canvas. This one is another example of Munch's, I'm going to say it, it's perverted feelings about sexuality, this half-nude in a black skirt. Despite everything, like I said again, despite every attempt that he makes to make this sexual, it's not. It's sadder. And despite the face not being drawn through at all, 3 pastel lines up there, it's depressing, and it's a deep portrait of this person who I don't know whether she wanted to be in this hellhole of monks, whether she just needed the money. You can think for a while about this. Another one of Munch's depressing artworks, this sick child, where the mother's face is obstructed because she knows that the child is going to die, despite the child's lightness, which gives us a bit of hope that she's going to stay alive through this disease. The light is this slimy yellow, which is a sickness that, again, isn't a good light of your face. And I feel like Munch here remembers when his sister and his mother died, and he's paying them both tribute in this artwork. How they made him who he is, and how he now has to carry this feeling around and portray it out to everyone. Separation. This one is a good development of the 3 ages of a woman, and this one is a lot more direct. The heartbroken young man in the foreground with this airy woman in the background, who, just by her pose, you could see, once again, and by the color, superiority, instantly there. This is why I think Munch never got married. He could never get over this hurdle. He could never get over this feeling that he was inferior to all of the women around him in his life. It's a strange feeling, and it's a depressing one for sure, and he lets us open up to the darkest problems in our own lives. Again, simplest way. This is why I love expressionism. Because classical art has usually veils emotion behind pretty drapes, pretty colors, rosy clouds. No. Expressionism tears off the skin and gives us the meat of the problem. And this one too. This is a strange one. Summer night. Again, what should you be thinking about on a summer's night? A normal person. You should be thinking about what a good day it was. What a good time you had in the forest. No. Munch can think about darkness. Munch can think about this ghostly face of all of his depression looking at him and looking through him. We ignore nature. Nature doesn't matter anymore. What matters is this created problem in the world. A continuation of Munch's Kiss. Not to say that I like this one more than the previous one. I like the blue one more. It's a lot more awkward with the composition. It lets you show what he really was thinking about. But here, he still carries on the theme that people don't have faces. What you see is just a mask. Every time you look at a person, every time you try to read their emotion, it's always masked. When people are most authentic in this moment of weakness or this moment of love, they lose their faces and they blend into each other, and they blend into themselves in a way. A good time to think about this. This one is a wonderful, wonderful portrait, and I'm very sad that I couldn't get a better quality reproduction of it. This is Henrik Ibsen, one of the best writers of Norway. He was the writer behind Peer Gynt, behind Grieg's great opera. And a lot of people recently don't know anything about Scandinavian literature. And yet Scandinavian literature of this early 20th century, late 19th century is fascinating. Because like no other nation, well maybe except Japan, Japan and Scandinavia have had this incredible feeling of solitude in front of the modern period coming to Europe. The rest of Europe is going to only figure it out after World War I. But there's 3 countries that figured it out before then. Russia, Scandinavia, and Japan. Nobody else. And so I can draw parallels between Ibsen and between the Japanese writer Akutagawa. Akutagawa's work, I believe it's called In the Bamboo Forest, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's this, very shortly, the story of a samurai getting murdered in the forest, and at the trial, different people saying the same story, but it always ending up with a different outcome, and finally the samurai's ghost appearing in court. It's a wonderful piece of literature that shows the ambiguity. And Ibsen, in his works, had very similar approaches to it. It's simultaneously this isolation, and at the same time, all the people around you in a chorus, yapping at you in every direction, trying to grab you. And it's a good thing if you thought about Munch's anxiety right now, because it fits in perfectly well. There's a couple of writers where Munch's artworks would fit in as a perfect illustration. And while Akutagawa may not be the one, just because of the Japanese aesthetic and the different thematic, Ibsen is definitely one of the writers. We're going to talk about another one in a short while. This study of a model, I'm going to skip through this one fairly quickly, just because we've seen the nude in a skirt, and I don't have much to say about this one than about the previous one. Strange eroticism. We for the life of me, I cannot figure out Munch's feelings at this point. This one is another interesting one, where, if you remember Ashes, he basically dials this up to 10 in this artwork. He says the same exact thing, just makes it more clear for everyone. The man is hunched up, trying to hide his face and his body, and the woman's face and body is exposed. But at the same time, that doesn't bring any joy to everyone. And the man is steamrolled, he's insignificant, and Munch cannot get over this complex. And whenever you see this, you cannot get over his complex either. Another nude from him. I'm going to just give you a quick run through of these, just so you know where you look when you recognize this art. And this is a study for another artwork, to which we'll get to in a moment, because I mentioned Adam and Eve of Masaccio on purpose. Because every single good artist, I'm going to say a very, very controversial thing, but every single good artist has to interpret a religious scene in order to get to that different point. And Munch does that in what he calls metabolism, what is obviously here an image of Adam and Eve at the Tree of Knowledge. Except he gives a different spin to it. If early Dutch artists emphasized the theme of temptation and human sinfulness, here we have an indifference. Humans can be sinful or not. They can do whatever they want. But this looming death still awaits them. Underneath that tree of knowledge is death. And that is the fundamental knowledge. That is the only one that we're given. We are given the knowledge of death and of nothing else. Because as soon as we took a bite out of that apple, we became mortal. And we have to face that now. And I believe that's why this artwork is called metabolism. We have to digest this now. How are we going to live with this from this point on? And we haven't figured it out for the however many thousands of years humans have been around. We're still digesting it. This one is one of Munch's favorite artworks, and this one is called The Dance of Life, and this is one of the few ones that he actually gave us an interpretation for. In the center, it's a proven self-portrait with one of his early loves. In the far right is a widow who cannot participate in the dance, in the country dance, because her husband recently died. And on the far left, we have an idealized version of this young love. And that's what we have here. This contrast of love and death, as always, what Munch has to show. And it shouldn't really be called the Dance of Life, it should be called the Dance of Death, because Munch said what this painting is about. It's about this fleeting moment, where we can't really stop and look and smell the roses no matter how hard we try. We're always going to be nicking ourselves at, like, what's going to happen next? What's going to happen later? What am I doing in this world? This one is fascinating. I did not know about this artwork before I began my research about Munch. This is the scene of the Golgotha, the scene of the crucifixion. And with this artwork, I see parallels all the way back to the birth of European art, all the way back to Giotto. Because in Giotto's crucifixion, it's a mural. It's a wonderful mural. If you're ever in Italy, there's one city I'm going to recommend, and that's Assisi. And the Church of St. Francis of Assisi, in the lower Chiesa, on the left side of it, there's a mural of Christ's crucifixion. And you are on the level of this crowd, just like in this scene right here, you're on the level of the crowd. And when you look up, you're picked up to the level of Christ, but you can't hold your head up for that long, and you inevitably fall down, and you fall down into this crowd. And I believe this is the same effect that Munch tried to give us. He puts you in the crowd. The first thing you see isn't Christ. It's that face of the old man in the front. And then you move on to the laughing faces and the jeering faces and the people pointing at Christ. But everyone's turned away from him. They don't see his message. Even the people who should see it don't. And Christ is left alone. And I believe this is another self-portrait of the person who's always left alone, of you, when you think the whole entire world is against you and no one understands you. This is an absolutely blasphemous artwork of putting yourself in the place of Christ, but it works, and it gives you the feeling that not a lot of artists have tackled. People have tackled with Christ's mortality, they've tackled with his human part, with his divine part, but no one ever asks two questions. Whether Christ laughed, and whether Christ was alone. We know he cried, we know he felt all that emotion, but was he ever alone? That's a good question for every one of us to think about. This one, I feel, is taken straight out of Edward Burne-Jones's Island of the Dead. If you remember the myth of King Arthur, where after King Arthur is dead, he is brought to the island of Avalon on the boat by the Lady of the Lake. Sorry for that. This is it, in my opinion. This is this Island of the Dead, and this is, I think, Munch's another attempt to wrestle with his idea of suicide. Because at this point, 1900, Munch is already heavily drinking, he's an alcoholic, he's having problems with himself, with others. He feels like his peak has passed. He made all of his great artworks already. And so he draws this. If you remember the quote from before, why live? This is an answer. Why live? Because the alternative is this Island of the Dead. This Avalon. Which we don't know what's going to be on there. Whether it's going to be good or not. Or whether it's going to be nothing like Epicurus said. I'm bringing up a lot of philosophers today. And there's a point for this. And Munch comes back. This is probably one of the lightest of his artworks. And yet it still has an aura of sadness, because if you take a close look at it, it's the same exact bridge on which the scream happened, just from the opposite direction. And if you take a look here, what for Munch was a scream of nature, for these girls is just a normal day. An evening day on the bridge across town. Nothing much. Fascinating. And this is complete impressionist, the impressionist point of view right here. Painting the same subjects in different lights and in different times of day to see how it changes. And this is a drastic change. Again. Another nude. And I'm going to quickly skip through this one, but just take a look at the fear in its eyes. This is a rare case of Munch drawing the face more thoroughly. And you can see fear. Those eyes. Horrifying. This self-portrait, although it's, again, very undetailed, this self-portrait in hell, it's this continuation of what I talked about with the Island of the Dead. This, in my opinion, is the closest we get to Munch's actual thoughts. What he thinks about himself. Because what he thought about himself was he's going to belong in hell after he dies. Because by his moral compass, he wasn't a good person. He was always sad. He never did anything about it. He wasn't a good student. He left to do art. And so we have this. He exposes himself. The only self-portrait to do so, by the way. One of the only ones, actually. And this very unusual orange color for him. Because usually it's relegated to the skies in the Scream. But not here. Here it's everywhere. And he himself is orange, but still has that dark shadow on top of it. This darkness that he's been carrying all of his life. I know I've been saying that a lot, but you can't talk about Munch without talking about darkness. This one's an interesting one. I had the pleasure of seeing this one in the Brooklyn Museum. And it's unique. It's a lot smaller than you think, like most artworks are. But this one is strange. Because it's a black and white lithograph. What you see sometimes with Munch, it's not that rare. But it's a rare depiction of him showing an honestly happy person. That's the only feeling I get. Because there may be a bit of melancholy in it, but the smile is still more happy than it is sad. Maybe I'm wrong, but you tell me. This one is Munch trying to be a social artist again. Christmas in the brothel, it's depressing. What can I say? This feeling of people who have to work in this, in a way, dirty job on probably one of the holiest days for a Christian Norway. And this woman, I've heard the theory that what she's reading is the gospel, which is a wonderful joke, if I can call it so. Smoking in a brothel, reading the gospel in a Christmas tree. Can you imagine that I said that in a single sentence? This portrait I'm going to spend quite a while on, because it's the portrait of Friedrich Nietzsche. And this is why I've been hyping up philosophy for the longest time today. If there is an artist and a philosopher who ever worked together incredibly well, it's these two. It's Edvard Munch and Friedrich Nietzsche. Nietzsche pushed the idea that God is dead, and we killed him. Munch says, well, what do we have left? And if Nietzsche says that you need to embrace yourself, and, as he said, build your house at the edge of a volcano just to laugh at nature, Munch says, well, not so fast. Because remember what that nature can do. It could scream at you, and you're going to be there stuck. And this is the only positive portrait that I believe Munch ever did. The only portrait that frames a person in the positive light. Because Munch, I believe, admires Nietzsche. And he admires him for one reason. He was able to overcome his darkness and show the power of the human again. He abandons God. He abandons every kind of moral structure that was there to support people, and he says, no, I can stand on my own 2 feet. Even if this life is going to be repeated over and over, I'm still going to be here, and I'm still going to be Nietzsche, and I'm still going to stick it to the big man upstairs. And even though he has that melancholic look on his face, watch where this portrait is set. It's set on the exact same bridge that the scream was on. And you know what happens to the sky? It lightens up, just for Nietzsche. For anyone else, for you, for me, for Munch, it's going to be bloody and it's going to be screaming. But for Nietzsche, for the one Übermensch that ever existed, it's going to be calm, just because he is there. And a quick moment. Nietzsche was in no way a nihilist. Remember in the beginning we talked about nihilists. He wasn't. And the people who mistakenly critique him or love him because they think he's one, he's not. Because he doesn't say that if God is dead, then there's nothing. He says, if God is dead, we are everything. And we should strive to become everything. We are the giants. We are the Übermensch. Nietzsche is an incredible philosopher. Hopefully one day we can talk more about him. But I feel like he is relevant to this art, to this conversation more than anywhere else. He is, in a way, the epitome of the darkness that Munch faced. And if I ever want to see an artwork on the cover of The Gay Science or Thus Said Zarathustra, I want it to be Munch. Because Munch and Nietzsche gave us 2 formulas of how to address the modern age. God is dead, and what next? And this is what's next. You can either sulk around in the depression, and you can either scream with nature, or you can rise up above it. And just like Nietzsche, coughing up blood while writing Thus Said Zarathustra, be that superior being. This would be an amazing way to cut off this lecture, but we have to carry on. This is probably one of my favorite artwork of Munch. Alongside the vampire and, of course, the scream, this one is probably the one closest to me. But what we have next is Munch obviously sulking back down after this moment of greatness, sulking back down and going back to the 3 ages of a woman. This time he does it even more literally with color. He makes it white, red, and black just to show this transformation. Hope, pride, and death. I'm not going to spend too much time on this one either, because we talked a lot about the previous iteration of it, which I believe to be a lot more impactful than this one. But I want you to show how he repeats this art over and over again. And here we have this self-portrait with a bottle of wine. Probably the epitome of his second period of depression. Like I said, he was an alcoholic, and this is his cry of pain. He's not screaming anymore, he's just looking at you. And he's asking for help, but no one's going to be there to give it, because those people in the background, they don't care, and neither do you, and that's why he's looking a bit past you. Fascinating. Fascinating artwork. It's rare that a person transmits his own depression onto his art. Very few cases of that in not just art, but literature and film. Usually people want to talk about the positive, because there's always enough negative in our lives. No. Munch throws us into the deep end of his emotions. What you may not know about him, though, is that he was also a photographer. And this photograph is, I feel, such a powerful expression of how he treated art. Because if he had the opportunity to do the same with photography, he would. If you notice, it's absolutely in no way different from the sketches that he makes in pastel or the works that he makes in paint. Same pose, same feeling, and it seems like he's transmitting his feelings onto the woman in a photograph, which is something you never see. Usually a photograph captures the moment. It captures the feeling that a person has in that moment. This one is Munch pushing his feelings onto a person, and the moment feels timeless and it stretches out into an infinite length. It's that scream, that split-second screams that he put into his art, but this time he takes time and he transforms it over. It's time becomes chewing gum that's being pushed over and over again, and it doesn't change. Fascinating. I haven't seen a photographer like Munch, ever. What we have here is a continuation of that theme, but this is a rare case of Munch trying to, once again, attack his feelings. Attack the feelings that he has about women, pushing down this time. He's a different art style. You can see how he violently has these vertical brushstrokes that he does with I believe, a paint knife even, not even a brush. And it's a violent artwork, a lot more violent than what he previously tried with his attacks with The Day After. Strange one. Don't have much to say about it because it's so uncharacteristic for him. What we have here, though, is an interesting case. The death of Marat. Just to remind you, Marat was this French revolutionary writer who was confined to a bath due to a disease that he had. And so throughout the French Revolution, he would hammer away writing these articles from his bath until a woman, I forget her name, she came into his house with a list of what she claimed were suspected anti-revolutionaries, and she stabbed him in the bathtub. And what we have here is Munch depicting the moment after that. Jacques-Louis David, in The Death of Marat, made Marat heroic, holding the pen in his last moments, still writing for the revolution. But I'm going to say a terrible thing. David was vulgar as all hell. And Munch shows the authenticity of the moment, this happiness that a person has, killing their greatest nightmare. Marat was the nightmare of revolutionary France. He could point at anyone in Paris and say they were counter-revolutionary, and they would be sent to the guillotine. And this triumph, again, of a woman over man, this triumph over the scariest man in Paris, and makes him look feeble. And this is a self-portrait again. And you know why I know it's a self-portrait? Because Munch staged a photograph of himself as Marat in a bathtub over here. Again, a very strange moment where he freezes time. And by all accounts, this is a ruined photo. So you moved in the photo, it's smudged out, but it works. Again, it's fascinating how good of a photographer he was. Absolutely fascinating. This artwork is also called Melancholy, but for a different reason. Munch abandoned the theme of melancholy being the young man sitting at the beach looking out into the waters, and now it's a woman. And despite the bright appearance, it's still called Melancholy. This, I would, if I had to guess, without knowing who this artist was, I would have said it was Matisse, because it's usually Matisse who has these bright, animalistic colors jumping at you, these oranges and reds. But no, it's Munch, and he gives us a very unique perspective at sadness and melancholy. No matter how bright the world is around you, if you're stuck in that moment, nothing's gonna get it out of you except you yourself. This one is probably the brightest of all of Munch's works, which could be a pun on my part, but it is. But somehow he makes the sun look a bit sad, how the sun takes over everything in the world. You kind of, in a way, feel sorry for the ground and for the water that are obscured by the sun. Another strange painting, which I have not a lot to say about, just because it's so out there for an artist like Munch. This one is a unique one, because here Munch takes the gloves off. He says, I've been working with nudes the wrong way. I've been showing them in these poses. And here Munch says, I can make an erotic pose look depressing. And he does. What should be an erotic pose of a woman, of a model lying on the bed. No, he turns it around, he makes it crying, he has the hair flow down, obstructing everything, the face, the body. We don't know who it was. It's a monster sitting down who has to do her job as a model, but can't. And more than anything, again, it makes me wonder what Munch's studio was like. Because this is horrifying. This isn't just an art studio. This is a mental asylum. Another one of his social artworks, and we're reaching the beginning of World War I, where the whole universe is collapsing. And I feel like Munch here decides to step back to the road of Carl Johann with the people staring at you. Except this time these aren't skulls, these are people. But instead of eyes, they have these black holes that pull you inside of them. And this, in a way, inverted, well, not inverted, but how do I call this? Shifted, maybe, perspective, where you are put both at the feet and at the face level of the worker in front. Which is, again, interesting. If you remember the worker at a bar in the beginning, this is a continuation of that theme. But what Munch did here is something that no cubist managed to do. And he managed to show two perspectives at the same time. Both the greatness of these people, these workers, and how empty and dead they are on the inside. And here, during the darkest years of Europe, during World War I, Munch comes back to the vampire. And this one he does call Vampire in the Forest. So we could say that he did think of the original one as basically sucking the energies out of the person trying to get some consolation. But I don't know, because this one, again, it's placed in a light composition, but as we've seen with previous depictions of the forest by Munch, it doesn't always have to be that way. What he's trying to tell us is, again, despite the sunny appearance, despite the nature, you're still stuck with those problems, and you're still stuck with those people trying to grab your life energy out of you. And World War I comes to an end, and the Spanish flu comes. And now on top of alcoholism, depression, Munch grabs sickness. And so we have this sick, broken person who's now drawing out of his last attempt. He doesn't even care about his face anymore. He just wants to show you the feeling he's in. The bed in the background with the sheets, you could see that it's almost like a 3-year-old drew this with these motions of a brush. Any art teacher would tell you that that's horrible. You don't paint this way. And the wall in the background, you see the paper looking through the orange paint. That's not how you paint. But it works, and it gives you the demeanor, again, of how much sadness this person has immersed himself in. This one, I think, is the happiest nude Munch has ever painted. One who doesn't look sad, one who's not crying, one who's not in an awkward pose that's diminishing her. And I wonder why it's called the cat, because it's not Munch trying to say that, people are animals. No. In a way, I think it's a more positive thing, and even a little playful on his part. Maybe even a joke, although I don't know how this person could have joked. But then he comes right back to it. This model by the wicker chair, face obstructed by hair, and the nude is once again relegated to be a demonstration of sadness, how you're naked in front of the world. When we talked about Klimt, about the difference between nakedness and nudity. Munch is an artist that gives us nakedness, because nudity is something a bit artificial. It's a pose. It's what a model shows you. Munch wants to show you nakedness. He wants you to strip away any ideas you have about this artificial nudity and wants to show you the person undefended by anything, by clothes, by an emotional barrier, just bare. And here we have another one, The Artist and His Model, which is another self-portrait, which, again, the later works of Munch, they lose this pastel charm that he had in the earlier works. He reverts exclusively to paint and to tempera, and it gives a strange feeling because he doesn't finish any of these artworks. He leaves bits of paper or canvas looking through, bare, unpainted. This is unfinished in all regards, but it still gives that feeling. And this is a very dark artwork, with the model being in a way, dominated by the artist for once, but even the artist looks confused and feels like the model has the power over him. It's a very strange dynamic. And then we have this Starry Night. Munch comes back to his teacher. He comes back to Van Gogh. And like I said, Van Gogh drew his Starry Night out of his insane asylum, out of the mental hospital. Munch draws it out of his own model, out of his own studio, out of his house in Oslo. Not much happier either. It's the same sadness, except with Van Gogh, he knew that he had a problem. Munch knows, but he doesn't know how to get out of it. Van Gogh took this next step. He took the suicide. He decided enough was enough. Munch can't take it. He can't take the step. He explored that area in his art. He keeps dragging it through and through. And you see how the time interval between works is increasing. If 1894 was miracle artwork after miracle artwork, here it's 5-10 years between artworks, and otherwise he fills the gap with copies of his earlier works. And then we come to 1943. And this is a turning point, because at this point, the Nazis are in power in Germany. They've invaded Norway. They've invaded all of Europe. And they've declared Munch's art as degenerate. Alongside other modernists like Paul Klee, alongside Juan Miro, he and other artists were declared degenerate. That this was not art that the German Aryan race should be looking at. And again, Munch shows how hopeless it is against him. He's between the clock and the bed. He's between the unstoppable marching of time and between the deathbed in which he depicted so many other people, if you remember. The sick child, the dying woman. He's there now. He is, at this point, about 80 years old. He's going to die in January of 1944. This is his last couple of works. And it's this last stretch of giving us that he never really solved any of his problems, no matter how hard he tried. He spilled all of his emotions onto the canvas for us, and yet it didn't help. And with this, we have this last artwork. Munch comes back to pastel, and he gives us this last self-portrait. What he tells us is, looking straight at us, like in all of his previous artworks, with eyes like two giant black holes. What he gives us is, drawing his own dying self-portrait, is that there may not always be an answer. And there may not always be a way out. And no matter how much depression he has gone through, he has always gone on. Even if he didn't know why. He had ups and downs. He'd met incredible people. He'd met Ibsen. He'd met Strindberg. He met Nietzsche. But did it really help him at the end of the day? Did those ideas really impact him? And what really was in his mind throughout? Was it the scream of nature that he witnessed on that bridge over the fjord? Was it Nietzsche's philosophy that he read? Or was it the death of his family so early that he just never could let go of, and that he drove throughout his love life and throughout his personal life? Maybe. And maybe Munch never answered those questions for himself, but all of us need to answer them for ourselves. Because without this, we're going to be stuck in the same endless loop as Munch was. And Munch did a great service to us. He gave us an opportunity to look at ourselves from another side, and to immerse ourselves into the saddest and lowest points of our lives and say, do you want to stay there? Or do you want to move on and do something else? And I hope to each and every one of you listening today that you ask these questions from yourself, and that you have the strength and the power to move on with the help of great art. Because that's what art should be. It should expose a feeling inside of you that you never had. So, one last question. Will you get out? Will you keep thinking about this thing? Or are you going to take the step in the right direction?